I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
You guys don't need to worry about me getting revenge from Diddy. I've got 3 moves that make sure he'll never be able to come after me or my family. First, I personally reached out to the victims' legal teams. The real reason he's not getting out is those buried cases behind the scenes. I provided legal funding for 7 victims who had been silent for years and brought in the top criminal attorneys in the country. Second, I bought up every potential post-release business deal he had lined up. I planned this 2 years in advance, so by the time he got sentenced and still had hope of getting out, every partner had already cut ties with him. Third, I don't just have evidence, I've got backups. This is an entire minefield that's been buried for 20 years. I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years. With testimonies from the victims, we interviewed over a dozen people he tricked, threatened, or violated. You think that's harsh? No, he destroyed other people's lives for decades. I'm just making sure he spends a few extra years in prison for it. I'm not afraid of his people, not afraid of his threats. I know he's still in there fantasizing about a comeback, but the truth is, he's never coming back.
Today, Thursday, January 29th, 2026 is a very bad day for Sean Diddy Combs, and an equally uncomfortable one for Jay-Z, because Netflix has just released Sean Combs, The Reckoning, Part 2, produced by 50 Cent. And this time, it's not just allegations. Secret parties, closed-door gatherings, late-night events with young girls present, hidden relationships, private worlds never meant to be exposed, no conclusions yet, no final judgments, just a system that no longer feels invisible. When the first chapter of Sean Combs, The Reckoning, appeared, it didn't feel like a traditional exposé. There were no dramatic confrontations, no loud accusations thrown at the camera. Instead, it moved quietly, almost cautiously. The focus was on adult misconduct allegations, claims of inappropriate behavior, in stories that were said to have taken place far away from public view. Not on stages, not at award shows, but in private rooms, late hours, and controlled environments where visibility didn't exist. What made this unsettling wasn't a single story. It was the way those stories echoed each other. Different people, different timelines, yet similar descriptions of what allegedly happened behind closed doors. The documentary didn't rush to conclusions. It didn't declare guilt. It simply placed accounts next to patterns and allowed viewers to notice the alignment on their own. And that approach changed everything. Because when something is repeated often enough, quietly enough, it stops sounding like coincidence. It starts sounding like routine. These were not framed as sudden incidents. They were presented as environments, spaces where certain behaviors were allegedly normalized, not questioned, private gatherings, controlled access, situations where power dynamics were already established before anyone entered the room. The film showed how influence can reshape boundaries, how authority can make silence feel expected, and how reputation can discourage questions without ever asking for compliance. What stood out most was the absence of reaction afterward. No strong denials, no detailed explanations, just distance. That distance spoke louder than any statement, because silence, when it follows serious questions, doesn't calm suspicion, it feeds it. And before we go any deeper into this story, make sure you support this video. Before going to deeper of this video, make sure you like this video, subscribe our channel, and hit the bell icon. That's how you never miss any update. As viewers absorb this first chapter, many realize something important. The documentary wasn't trying to shock, it was trying to document a culture where access mattered more than accountability, where private behavior rarely faced public consequences, and where uncomfortable stories were easier to ignore than to confront. The stories presented weren't isolated, they existed within a system built on influence, loyalty, and discretion. People described feeling uneasy but unsure why. Others described recognizing patterns only in hindsight, and some described understanding, even back then, that certain spaces operated under different rules. Rules that weren't written, rules that didn't need to be explained, because everyone in those rooms already knew them. And the documentary's power came from restraint. It never forced emotion. It allowed discomfort to build naturally, and that discomfort lingered long after the episode ended. By the time part one concluded, one thing was clear. This wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a larger examination, not just of individuals, but of how power, silence, and access can coexist for years without challenge. The industry wasn't shaken because something was proven. It was shaken because too many people recognized the structure being shown. And once you recognize a structure, you can't pretend it was never there. What followed after the first release was not outrage. It was something colder, waiting. People expected answers. They expected denial, clarification, explanations. None of that came. Instead, there was silence. And silence has weight. However, because when serious questions are raised and no one rushes to respond, the absence itself becomes part of the story. And that absence is exactly where this chapter begins. The focus now moves away from what was said and toward what kept returning. Unverified accusations, not sworn testimony, not courtroom claims, but stories that refused to disappear. They surfaced in different years, through different voices, in different places, yet carried the same shape. Private settings, restricted access, controlled environments. And when accounts like that repeat, they stop feeling random. This section doesn't try to prove anything. It observes persistence, because false stories usually fade. These didn't. They lingered quietly, passed from person to person, often framed as warnings rather than accusations. Things people said carefully. Things they said only when they felt safe. And over time, those warnings began to overlap. The documentary then shifts its attention to alignment. Not public alignment, private alignment. People who appear distant in interviews. People who claim no connection publicly. Yet behind the scenes, their timelines kept intersecting. Same locations, same nights, same private gatherings. No photos, no announcements, just proximity. The film never claims these alignments were planned. It asks something more uncomfortable. Why did separation exist publicly while closeness existed privately? Why did certain individuals always seem to move together when visibility was limited? This is where hidden alliances begin to form in the narrative. Not alliances written in contracts, not partnerships announced to the world, but understandings. Understandings that didn't require explanation because everyone involved benefited from discretion. The documentary slows down here because this is where power operates best, quietly. When relationships don't exist officially, they can't be questioned officially. And when they can't be questioned, they can't be challenged. What becomes unsettling is how long these patterns allegedly lasted. Years passed, public images changed, but private proximity remained. The film suggests that this kind of persistence isn't accidental. It requires effort, coordination, and mutual interest. As viewers, you're not pushed toward outrage. You're invited to notice repetition, to notice how often silence followed alignment, how often distance appeared only when cameras were present, and how often no one felt the need to explain. By the end of this chapter, nothing explosive has been revealed, no single moment that forces a reaction. Yet the pressure feels heavier, because once you recognize that unanswered questions were allowed to sit for years, the issue is no longer about accusation. It's about protection. Protection of relationships, protection of access, protection of systems that rely on not being examined too closely. This part doesn't end with conclusions. It ends with a realization that silence wasn't passive, it was active. And once you see silence as a choice, you start asking who benefited from it and why it was maintained for so long. At this stage, the story stops being about what was said and starts becoming about who was always there. Because when accusations remain unanswered and alliances remain unspoken, a presence becomes the most revealing detail of all. The documentary begins paying close attention to patterns of access. Who entered private spaces without invitations? Who stayed when events shifted late into the night? Who appeared again and again, even when there was no public reason for them to be involved? These weren't open environments. They were controlled spaces, Invite-only rooms where familiarity mattered more than credentials, where silence wasn't requested, it was assumed, and where everyone understood that what happened inside didn't leave with them. Over time, these environments allegedly created inner circles. Not official groups, not documented teams, but private networks built on trust, discretion, and shared exposure. People inside these circles didn't need introductions. They didn't ask questions. And they didn't explain their presence, they simply belonged. The documentary doesn't suggest formal rules were written. It suggests something more powerful. Understanding. An understanding of who had access, who didn't, and who benefited from staying quiet. What becomes unsettling is how consistent these inner circles appear across time. Different years, different locations, the same small group of people moving through the same types of spaces. Not because they were required to be there, but because those spaces functioned around them. The film introduces accounts describing how proximity to these circles felt both privileged and restrictive. Being close meant opportunity, but it also meant expectation. Expectation to observe without speaking, to participate without documenting, to accept without questioning. And for some, especially those newer or less established, that expectation carried weight. Not spoken pressure, but felt pressure. Pressure that comes from imbalance. The imbalance between experience and inexperience, between authority and access, between those who controlled the environment and those trying to find their place within it. The documentary never claims manipulation. It doesn't assign intent. It focuses on dynamics, how power shapes behavior without instruction, how silence becomes easier than disruption, how belonging can slowly replace boundaries. As these inner circles repeated over time, the environments themselves became normalized. What once felt unusual began to feel routine. What once raised questions became familiar, and familiarity is where accountability often disappears. And the film suggests that this normalization is what allowed these spaces to exist for so long without challenge. Not because everyone agreed with what was happening, but because challenging it felt riskier than accepting it. Risky to opportunity, risky to access, risky to reputation. As the narrative moves forward, the focus remains calm, deliberate. No dramatic accusations, no emotional escalation. Just the slow realization that repeated presence creates responsibility. And when the same people are always present in the same private environments over many years, it stops being coincidence. It becomes structure. By the end of this chapter, the discomfort deepens, because the question is no longer about what may have happened in one moment. It's about how many moments passed without interruption, how many times silence was chosen, how many times familiarity replaced scrutiny, and how inner circles, once formed, are almost impossible to penetrate from the outside. Not because they are hidden, but because they are protected. Protected by access, protected by influence, protected by the understanding that staying inside meant survival. And once that understanding takes hold, the most powerful force in the room is no longer authority, it's silence. Silence that isn't empty. Silence that is shared. Silence that allows structures to exist long after they should have been questioned. And once you notice that, the story no longer feels distant. It feels deliberate. As the picture becomes clearer, attention shifts to something even harder to define. Relationships that never officially existed. Connections that were never confirmed, never announced, even never explained, yet somehow never disappeared either. Publicly, there was distance, carefully maintained separation, different interviews, different narratives, different lanes. Privately, the same names kept appearing in the same places. Not in headlines, not in photos, but in proximity, private gatherings, restricted environments, moments where access was limited and visibility was controlled. The documentary doesn't present contracts or messages, it presents time. Time spent in the same rooms, time overlapping in the same cities, time aligning again and again when coincidence should have ended long ago. What makes this unsettling is not one appearance, it's consistency. Consistency across years creates questions that image management can't fully erase. When these associations were never acknowledged, but they were never denied either, and that silence becomes meaningful. Because denial closes doors, silence keeps them open. The film explores how certain relationships were quietly preserved while being erased publicly. No shared credits, no visible collaborations, no public acknowledgement of closeness. Yet privately, the connection remained intact. The documentary suggests that this dual existence was intentional. Public distance reduced scrutiny. Private familiarity maintained access. And that balance allowed these relationships to survive every shift in public perception, every controversy, every moment where separation would have been safer. What becomes clear is how carefully this was managed. Not aggressively hidden, just normalized. So normal that no one questioned it anymore. So routine that curiosity faded. Because when something exists long enough without challenge, it stops feeling suspicious. It starts feeling expected. The film introduces accounts of people who sense these bonds without being able to explain them. They noticed who always arrived together, who always had access, who never needed invitations, not because rules were broken, but because rules didn't apply to them. This is where influence shows its quietest form, not through control, but through continuity. When relationships persist without explanation, they signal value. And value like that isn't emotional, it's strategic. The documentary doesn't accuse these associations of wrongdoing. It doesn't need to. It asks why they endured, why they were protected, why they survived untouched while other connections were publicly dismantled. Now, as the timeline moves forward, the same pattern repeats. Different events, different eras, same closeness, same silence. And silence, when it lasts this long, is no longer neutral. It becomes a choice shared by everyone who benefited from not asking questions. By the end of this section, one realization settles in. These relationships weren't fragile. They weren't careless. They were maintained, quietly, deliberately, over time. And anything maintained with that level of consistency was never accidental. It was meant to last, not in public view, but exactly where it remained, out of reach. At this point, the focus shifts in a way that feels heavier than before, because now the story is no longer just about who was connected. It's about how those connections worked, and more importantly, who held the power inside them. The documentary begins examining relationships that were never clearly defined. No labels, no boundaries explained, no context offered, just proximity. One side carried influence, access, and authority. The other often carried opportunity, ambition, and dependence. That imbalance is impossible to ignore. Power in these spaces didn't need to be announced. It was already understood. Who controlled the room? Who decided who stayed? Who determined what was acceptable? And when power is uneven, silence takes on a different meaning. The film carefully introduces concerns around age gaps. Not numbers, not dates, but presence. Younger individuals appearing in environments dominated by older, established figures. Spaces where experience outweighed youth. Rooms where questioning didn't feel like an option. The documentary doesn't dramatize this, and it slows down, because discomfort doesn't need exaggeration. What becomes unsettling is how normal these situations were described to be. Not chaotic, not hidden in panic, routine, private gatherings where everyone understood the hierarchy, where youth was noticed, but never questioned. And that normalization matters, because when imbalance becomes routine, it stops feeling wrong. Some accounts describe feeling uncertain, but not enough to leave. Others describe feeling pressure, not through threats, but through expectation. Expectation to stay quiet, expectation to be grateful, expectation not to disrupt access. That kind of pressure doesn't need words. It exists in the structure. The documentary avoids assigning intent. It doesn't claim manipulation. It focuses on dynamics. How authority reshapes behavior. How opportunity can blur boundaries. How influence makes resistance feel costly. And once resistance feels costly, silence becomes survival. As the timeline continues, the same pattern repeats. Different events, different people, same imbalance. Those with power remain protected. Those without it, adjusted. The film suggests that this wasn't challenged because too many benefited from the arrangement. Access was maintained, influence remained intact, and questions quietly disappeared. By the end of this chapter, nothing explodes. There is no reveal, no moment of collapse, just a growing unease. Because the most troubling environments aren't always illegal. Sometimes they're simply unequal. And inequality, when left unchecked, creates conditions where harm doesn't need to be intentional to exist. What lingers is not accusation. It's realization. That power doesn't always abuse loudly. Sometimes it just exists. And everything around it bends. And once you see how these imbalances were built into the system, you can't look at the earlier connections the same way again. Not because something was proven, but because something was allowed. As the narrative moves deeper, the tone becomes more cautious and more unsettling. Because now the focus is no longer just imbalance, it's vulnerability. The documentary begins addressing rumors that many people were uncomfortable repeating for years. Not formal accusations, not legal statements, concerns. Concerns that surfaced quietly, often framed as unease rather than claims. Concerns about who was present in certain environments and whether they should have been. The film is careful here. It slows down. It chooses words deliberately because this isn't about declaring wrongdoing. It's about asking why certain situations were allowed to exist at all. Accounts describe vulnerable individuals being present in spaces designed for adults. Late-night settings, private gatherings, rooms where authority was already established and rarely questioned. No one claims force, no one claims certainty, but many describe discomfort that was easy to ignore and even easier to normalize. Because discomfort doesn't always announce itself as danger. Sometimes it looks like confusion. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like someone unsure whether they're allowed to leave. The documentary frames these stories as patterns of concern, not proof. Different voices, different years, the same uneasy descriptions. One in repetition changes how concern is understood. The film explores how exploitation doesn't always appear as a single dramatic act. Often it hides inside opportunity. Promises of mentorship, promises of access, promises of protection, promises that sound generous, but carry expectations that are never clearly stated. When vulnerability meets power, clarity becomes essential. And here, clarity was often missing. Some individuals describe feeling grateful to be included and uncomfortable at the same time. Grateful for access, uneasy about the environment. That contradiction is important because it's where vulnerability often lives. The documentary avoids sensationalism. It doesn't name perpetrators. It doesn't assign motives. It focuses on structure. How private environments were set up, how authority was concentrated, how silence was treated as normal, and how those conditions created risk, even without obvious intent. The film suggests that exploitation doesn't require cruelty. It requires imbalance and indifference. Indifference to discomfort, indifference to boundaries, indifference to who might be affected. As the timeline continues, the same concerns resurface. Young associates entering elite spaces, older figures controlling access. Questions left unasked because asking felt unsafe, and over time that silence becomes part of the system. Not because everyone agreed with what was happening, but because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying quiet. The documentary leaves this section unresolved on purpose. No conclusions, no verdicts, just a lingering question. If these environments were truly harmless, why do so many people describe leaving them with uncertainty instead of clarity? And if nothing was wrong, why was silence treated as a condition of belonging? Because exploitation doesn't always look like violence. Sometimes it looks like opportunity without protection, access without boundaries, and vulnerability placed too close to power for too long. And once that line blurs, even quietly, it becomes impossible to pretend it was never crossed. By now, the story no longer depends on events. It depends on what people remember. Because when records don't exist and confirmations never come, memory becomes the only evidence left behind. This is where the documentary turns toward whispers, not rumors shouted online, not accusations written down, but things people said quietly, carefully, only when they felt safe enough to speak. Narrow stories that circulated in hallways, studios, and private conversations for years, passed along as warnings, never as statements. The kind of comments that begin with hesitation, that end before details are given, because details carry risk. The film makes it clear that these whispers didn't start recently. They didn't appear after one incident. They existed for decades, changing slightly with time, but never disappearing. Different generations heard them. Different cities repeated them. Always the same tone: caution, unease, and understanding that certain topics weren't meant to be explored too deeply. What's unsettling is how familiar these whispers became. They weren't shocking. They were expected. Newcomers heard them early and learned quickly what not to ask. Veterans treated them as background noise, not because they believed everything, but because questioning meant exposure, and exposure came with consequences. The documentary doesn't try to verify these stories. It asks why they survived. Why, if nothing was there, did the whispers never fully fade? Why did so many people independently describe the same discomfort without coordination? Why did silence become the safest response? This is where reputation reveals its quietest form of power. Not through threats, through normalization. When something is whispered long enough without consequence, it stops demanding attention. It becomes part of the environment. The film includes accounts of people laughing things off at first, rationalizing what they heard, convincing themselves it wasn't their place to ask questions, because opportunity felt fragile, access felt conditional, and silence felt necessary. That silence didn't erase the whispers. It preserved them. Because what isn't challenged doesn't disappear. It settles. Over time, these unspoken stories began shaping behavior. People avoided certain spaces, prepared themselves mentally before entering others, learned which boundaries existed, even if they couldn't explain why. The documentary suggests that this is how private narratives survive, not through secrecy alone, but through shared avoidance. Everyone knows a little. No one knows enough, and that imbalance protects power. As this section unfolds, the atmosphere feels heavier, not louder, because whispers don't need proof to influence decisions. They only need repetition. They shape who people trust, who they follow, who they stay quiet around. By the end of this chapter, the realization is uncomfortable. If so many people heard the same things and adjusted their behavior accordingly, then the whispers themselves became a system built on fear of exclusion, on loyalty rewarded with access, on silence treated as professionalism. And systems like that don't collapse suddenly. They erode slowly. Only when enough people stop pretending they never heard anything at all. Because the most dangerous stories aren't the ones shouted publicly. They're the ones everyone knows but no one ever says out loud. At this point, the story turns towards something even more carefully protected. Not events, not behavior, identity. Not the identity shown in interviews, on stages, or in headlines, but the private identity that only existed behind closed doors. The documentary begins examining spaces where public image didn't apply. Invite-only gatherings, after-hours environments, rooms where nothing needed to be explained because nothing was meant to leave. These were not social events meant for visibility. They were controlled spaces built for discretion. No cameras, no phones, no records. People weren't there to be seen. They were there to feel safe from being seen. What becomes clear is that these environments operated under a different code. Outside, reputation mattered. Inside, silence mattered more. The film doesn't speculate about labels or definitions. It avoids assumptions. Instead, it focuses on protection. Protection of privacy. Protection of image. Protection of lives that could not exist publicly without consequence. Accounts describe how behavior shifted once doors closed. Not dramatically, not recklessly, subtly. Guarded personas relaxed. Public boundaries softened. Conversations changed. Not because rules were broken, but because different rules applied. The documentary suggests that these after-hours spaces were designed to separate identity from accountability. What happened inside stayed inside. Who someone was inside never followed them out. And that separation was fiercely guarded. Not out of fear, but out of necessity. Because exposure didn't just threaten reputation, it threatened power. Power built on consistency. Power built on control of narrative. Power built on deciding which versions of a person were allowed to exist publicly. The film highlights how access to these spaces was limited to those who understood discretion. Trust wasn't earned through time alone. It was earned through silence. Once someone proved they wouldn't speak, they were welcomed back. Once they questioned, access quietly disappeared. No confrontation, no explanation, just absence. This is where identity becomes leverage, not because of what it is, but because of how much effort goes into protecting it. The documentary never claims wrongdoing tied to identity itself. It suggests something more complex, that when private identity must be hidden to preserve influence, the systems guarding that influence grow rigid, aggressive about secrecy, unforgiving about exposure, uncomfortable with scrutiny. As this section unfolds, it becomes easier to understand why so many stories never surfaced. Not because they were unknown, but because revealing them would have exposed entire structures. Structures built to keep certain truths compartmentalized. And once compartments exist, silence stops being optional. It becomes expected. The final moments of this chapter linger on one idea. When privacy is protected more fiercely than accountability, the priority is no longer truth. It's preservation. Preservation of control. Preservation of access. Preservation of a carefully maintained separation between who someone is and who they are allowed to appear as. And when that separation is threatened, everything around it tightens. Because systems that survive on secrecy don't fear accusations the most. They fear exposure. Exposure that doesn't need proof, only visibility. And once visibility arrives, even quietly, nothing inside those rooms ever feels completely private again. By now, the pattern has fully formed. What once felt like isolated spaces now feels like a system built around celebration, but not celebration as the public understands it. These were not events meant to be remembered. They were events designed to disappear. Closed-door celebrations, restricted access parties, nights that existed outside normal time and visibility. The documentary focuses on how carefully these environments were controlled. Guest lists were limited. Access was selective. Rules were clear without being spoken. No phones, no cameras, no media. Not because something specific was guaranteed to happen, but because nothing was supposed to be documented. And documentation is the enemy of control. What becomes unsettling is how often these gatherings appear across the timeline. Different cities, different years, different reasons for celebration, on the same structure every time. Private locations, familiar faces, a shared understanding that what happened would never be discussed publicly. These weren't chaotic parties spiraling out of control. They were managed, carefully curated environments where hierarchy was instantly understood. Who could move freely? Who stayed close to power? Who observed quietly? The documentary suggests that these celebrations served a purpose beyond enjoyment. They reinforced loyalty. They tested discretion. They filtered trust. If someone respected the rules, they were invited back. If someone questioned the rules, they quietly disappeared from the list. No arguments, no confrontations, just exclusion. And exclusion is one of the most effective forms of discipline. Accounts describe how time felt different inside these spaces. Unnormal boundaries felt suspended. Behavior shifted subtly. What would feel inappropriate elsewhere felt accepted here, not because it was harmless, but because the environment normalized it. Normalization doesn't require agreement. It requires repetition, and repetition was constant. Over time, these closed-door celebrations stopped feeling secretive to those inside. They felt routine, expected, and routine is powerful. Once something becomes routine, it stops being examined. It stops being questioned. It stops being remembered clearly. The film highlights how memory becomes unreliable in these settings. No photos to confirm, no messages to reference, just recollection, fragmented and isolated. And isolated memories are easy to dismiss. But when enough isolated memories describe the same structure, dismissal becomes harder. When the documentary doesn't claim these parties were criminal, it doesn't need to. It asks why such extreme control was necessary, why visibility was treated as danger, why silence was treated as loyalty, why repetition was allowed to continue unchecked. Because celebrations don't require secrecy to exist. Only systems that fear exposure do. As this section nears its end, the realization settles in. These gatherings weren't side effects of fame. They were tools of influence, tools that created shared experiences without shared records, shared understanding without shared accountability. And once people experience something together that cannot be proven, they are bound by it. Bound by memory, bound by silence, bound by the risk of being the first to speak. The discomfort here doesn't come from what is shown. It comes from what is missing. No footage, no evidence, no proof, just patterns. Patterns that suggest these environments existed not by accident, but by design. Designed to protect, designed to control, designed to ensure that when questions finally came, there would be nothing concrete left behind, only silence. And silence, when shared by many, can protect almost anything for a very long time. At this point, the story begins to move outward, because systems built in private can only survive as long as the outside world doesn't look too closely. And now attention has shifted, not loudly, not aggressively, but enough to be felt. The documentary begins to observe subtle changes, not in statements, but in behavior. Schedules quietly adjusted, public appearances reduced, associations that once felt permanent suddenly became flexible. Nothing was announced, nothing was explained, but movement started happening. And movement is always a response. Power doesn't disappear when it's questioned. It recalibrates. The film shows how narratives begin to reposition themselves during this phase. Old moments are reframed as misunderstandings. Past silence is reframed as privacy. Distance is reframed as focus. Language becomes careful, neutral, strategic, not to inform, but to avoid creating records. Because records create accountability. What becomes clear is that visibility alone is enough to generate pressure. No charges are required, no verdicts are necessary. The moment patterns become visible, control weakens, and systems that rely on discretion are the least prepared for scrutiny. The documentary highlights hesitation, people watching each other, waiting to see who speaks first, so who stays quiet long enough to avoid attention. Because silence, once protective, now feels risky, and speech, once dangerous, now feels inevitable. This is the tension point, where loyalty is tested quietly, where alliances are reassessed privately, where distance becomes a strategy rather than a coincidence. Not because anything has been proven, but because everything feels possible. The film avoids prediction. It doesn't speculate on outcomes. It focuses on atmosphere. An atmosphere where certainty no longer exists, where control feels conditional, where even those at the center sense that the narrative is no longer fully theirs. And once that realization sets in, power begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. Because influence works best in silence, and silence is no longer invisible. As this section draws toward its end, one understanding becomes unavoidable. Systems don't collapse the moment they're seen. They weaken, they tighten, they adapt. And in doing so, they reveal their limits. Because when attention arrives, even quietly, everything built on secrecy must either change or be exposed further. And that choice, change or exposure, is where pressure becomes permanent. Not because someone forced it, but because it can no longer be avoided. Now the story enters its most uncomfortable phase. Not exposure, not collapse, waiting. Because once attention shifts and pressure builds, everyone begins watching everyone else. Not for answers, for reactions. The documentary focuses on this moment of pause, where nothing has officially happened, yet nothing feels stable anymore. Public confidence softens, certainty fades, movement becomes cautious. People don't rush to speak, they calculate. Statements are delayed, appearances are reconsidered, associations are quietly reviewed, and none of it is explained, because explanation creates permanence, and permanence creates risk. The film shows how narratives subtly change during this phase. Past behavior is reframed as misunderstood. Silence is reframed as dignity. Distance is reframed as personal focus. Words become softer, less specific, more careful. Not because clarity is the goal, but because ambiguity offers protection. This is where power reveals its limits, not because it disappears, but because it must respond. And response means visibility. The documentary suggests that this moment is often the most fragile for any protected system. Nothing has been proven. Nothing has been denied. Yet everything feels exposed. Those closest to the center begin reassessing loyalty quietly. Who might speak? Who might distance themselves early? Who might stay silent long enough to avoid consequence? Distance becomes a signal, not of guilt, but of anticipation. Anticipation of movement, anticipation of fallout, anticipation of change. The film captures how uncertainty reshapes behavior faster than accusation ever could. Because when people no longer know what will happen next, control becomes unstable. Influence depends on predictability, and predictability is gone. As this section unfolds, the tension doesn't come from action. It comes from restraint. Everyone waiting, everyone watching, everyone aware that the narrative is no longer fully contained. And once containment is lost, silence stops being enough. And the documentary doesn't tell viewers what will happen next. It shows how moments like this usually unfold. Not with announcements, not with sudden confessions, but with gradual shifts. Relationships cool, support becomes conditional, and isolation begins to form quietly around those once protected. This is the stage where systems begin to crack, not because someone attacks them, but because too many people stop holding them together. The chapter ends without resolution, no outcome, no closure, just a realization. That anticipation is more dangerous than exposure, because anticipation invites memory, invites reflection, invites people to question what they once accepted without thought. And once questioning becomes normal, the system has already lost its strongest defense. Not secrecy, but habit. And habits, once broken, never fully return. At the end of this story, there is no explosion, no final confession, no single moment where everything collapses at once. Because systems like this don't end dramatically. They unravel, slowly, quietly, under the weight of what they can no longer hide. What this documentary ultimately leaves behind is not proof. It's awareness. Awareness that certain patterns were allowed to exist for years. Awareness that silence was not accidental. Awareness that access, influence, and protection were deeply connected. For a long time, familiarity kept everything stable. The same faces, the same environments, the same rules that never needed to be written down. That familiarity created comfort, and comfort created blindness. But once attention arrived, even briefly, that comfort disappeared. Now silence feels different. Distance feels intentional, and absence feels louder than presence ever did. The documentary doesn't tell viewers what to believe. It removes something far more powerful: certainty. Certainty that things were harmless. Certainty that nothing was happening. Certainty that silence meant innocence. And once certainty is gone, control weakens. Because power depends on predictability, on people accepting what they have always accepted. That acceptance no longer exists. What remains is structure. The structure of how private environments were built, how loyalty was rewarded with access, how questioning was quietly discouraged, and how protection lasted as long as everyone played their role. Those structures don't vanish overnight, but once they're seen, they can never return to invisibility. The walls didn't fall today, they shifted. And when walls shift, they reveal cracks. Cracks where memories connect. Cracks where stories align. Cracks where silence stops working the way it used to. This story doesn't close a chapter, it opens one. A chapter where patterns are examined instead of ignored, where repetition is questioned, where absence is no longer mistaken for nothing. Because the most dangerous thing for any protected system is not accusation, it's recognition. Recognition that what was once hidden in private rooms is now being noticed in public. And once that happens, the system doesn't need to be destroyed. It begins to dissolve on its own, not through force, but through memory, because memory doesn't forget. And once people remember together, silence loses its power. That is where this ends, not with answers, but with awareness. And awareness, once it exists, never truly goes away. Now the focus turns to what happens after awareness settles in, Because recognition doesn't end a system. It changes how everyone moves inside it. The documentary begins to trace the quiet aftermath. Not public reactions, not statements. Behavior. Who keeps showing up? Who suddenly doesn't? Who becomes careful with proximity? Because once patterns are recognized, proximity becomes a signal. People start choosing distance not out of clarity, but out of calculation. Not because something has been proven, but because something has been noticed. The film shows how protection works when it can no longer rely on invisibility. Reputation becomes a shield again, but thinner this time. Access is tightened, circles shrink, conversations happen behind even fewer doors, and yet none of this is announced. Because announcing change would admit pressure. Instead, adjustments happen quietly. Schedules shift. Events become smaller. Invitations become selective. Not to hide, but to manage risk. The documentary suggests that this phase is about preservation. Preservation of influence. Preservation of alliances. Preservation of options. Because when scrutiny increases, flexibility becomes survival. What's unsettling is how quickly people adapt. Not out of fear, but out of instinct. They know how systems protect themselves. They've seen it before, so they move early, distance themselves before they're asked, clarify narratives before questions arrive, reframe relationships before anyone else does. This isn't panic, it's strategy. And strategy reveals intention without saying a word. The film emphasizes how silence evolves here. Earlier, silence meant comfort. Now silence means caution, the same lack of explanation, but with a different purpose, not to ignore questions, to avoid creating new ones. And avoidance becomes visible. Who declines invitations? Who stops being mentioned? Who becomes busy at the same time? Patterns appear again. Not the old ones, new ones. Patterns of retreat. The documentary doesn't claim guilt. It doesn't suggest collapse. It shows adaptation. How systems under pressure don't break immediately. They compress. They reduce exposure. They consolidate trust. They rely on fewer people. And fewer people means fewer risks. But it also means less insulation. Because when circles shrink, accountability grows. The film lingers on this tension. A system trying to remain intact while being watched. A network trying to move quietly while being noticed. A balance that becomes harder to maintain with every passing moment. As this chapter unfolds, the feeling isn't resolution, it's transition. From comfort to caution, from invisibility to awareness, from routine to recalibration, and recalibration always carries cost. Because not everyone can be protected at once. Not every relationship can be preserved. Not every silence can be maintained. Some connections fade quietly, others harden, and those shifts leave traces. Traces that weren't there before. The documentary ends this section with a simple understanding. Recognition doesn't destroy systems immediately. It changes incentives. And when incentives change, behavior follows. Quietly, deliberately, without explanation. Which is why this phase matters more than exposure ever could. Because it shows what people do when they believe they're being watched. And when they can no longer pretend they aren't. That's when the real story continues. At this point, the story reaches a place it was always moving toward. Not an ending, but exposure without spectacle. Because when pressure builds long enough, systems don't collapse. They reveal themselves. What becomes clear now is that nothing shown so far existed in isolation. Every silence supported another silence. Every private space depended on another private space. Every unspoken rule relied on everyone agreeing not to speak. And that agreement is no longer stable. The documentary doesn't claim a final outcome. It doesn't predict arrests, confessions, or dramatic turns. It focuses on something far more realistic. Momentum. What momentum created by patterns that are now visible. Momentum created by people connecting stories they once kept separate. Momentum created by the realization that too much was protected for too long. Because once a system is seen clearly, it can never return to normal. Even if nothing else happens. Even if no one speaks publicly tomorrow. The shift has already occurred. People now recognize the environments. They recognize the structures. They recognize the methods. Private gatherings no longer feel harmless. Silence no longer feels neutral. Distance no longer feels accidental. Everything has context now, and context is dangerous. The documentary suggests that what comes next doesn't depend on one person. It depends on accumulation. Accumulation of memory. Accumulation of awareness. Accumulation of people who quietly decide they no longer want to carry silence alone. That's how systems actually break. Not through force, through fatigue. Fatigue from protecting narratives. Fatigue from pretending not to notice patterns. Fatigue from maintaining structures that only benefit a few. The film lingers on this truth, that the most powerful change doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives when silence stops feeling worth it, when loyalty begins to feel one-sided, when access no longer justifies discomfort, when protection no longer feels guaranteed. And once that calculation changes, everything else follows. This story doesn't close with answers because answers were never the point. The point was visibility. Visibility of how influence operates in private, visibility of how environments are designed, on a visibility of how long silence can last when it's rewarded. Now that visibility exists, the outcome is no longer fully controllable because people are watching differently, listening differently, remembering differently, and memory is the one thing no system built on silence can survive. Not because memory accuses, but because it connects. It connects moments. It connects patterns. It connects people who once thought they were alone in what they noticed. That's where this truly ends. Not with collapse, not with closure, but with awareness spreading quietly, steadily, and irreversibly. And once awareness reaches that point, the question is no longer if things will change. It's who will still be protected when silence finally stops working.